Is it true that wild caught seafood could be less healthy than farm raised? Years ago, I came across an article by one of the big publishers that claimed exactly that. Their rationale is that wild caught seafood often has much higher levels of heavy metals, such as mercury and other contaminants. But as it turns out, that is only a small part of the story. What they did get right, however, is that farmed seafood can be healthier than wild caught. As you might expect, it all depends on the farm. In this episode, we demystify the world of fish, aquaculture, and seafood as a whole. Of course, we discuss the mercury content of seafood and how you can offset and protect yourself against it. We discuss the tremendous variability of the levels of nutrients and toxicity of the same fish just raised on different farms. Sometimes even neighboring farms have vastly different nutrition profiles. I learned from the interview and actually experienced personally from consuming their fish is that real high quality fish shouldn't have a strong fishy smell or taste, of course, with some exceptions. Our guest answers the biggest mistakes people make when buying seafood and preparing it at home. We explore other topics such as how chefs know that fresh fish is generally inferior to dry aged fish, kind of like with beef. We talk about the process of freezing the fish, defrosting the fish, parasites, everything you should know there. Then we talk about the biodynamic style aquatic ecosystem that yields the best seafood. We talk about the different factors that make Seatopia a unique service. And our guest even explains how the way that the seafood dies impacts the taste, the texture, and the nutrient quality. We discuss all that and a whole lot more. Our guest this week is James Arthur Smith. He's the founder of Seatopia and also a dedicated surfer and yachtsman. James has spent the last 8 years immersing himself in the aquaculture industry by personally visiting farms, eating, diving under the grow out pens, and testing the harvested products in the lab. His passion for the ocean led him to live abroad a sailboat for 10 years, sailing the eastern Pacific coastline from San Francisco, California, my hometown, to Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands. James is on a mission to deliver the best certified clean seafood to you, which will grow a sustained aquaculture seafood supply chain and help heal the planet. Now, I really didn't know what to expect before trying Seatopia for myself. I'm not a very big seafood fan, and especially the fish that tastes and smells fishy. So when they sent me a bunch of different types of seafood that I've never seen or tried, I was a bit hesitant. And I even decided to give certain things that I've tried and disliked another shot, such as scallops. I've never liked scallops, never cooked scallops, and to my surprise, after meeting with the complimentary chef that you get to meet with when you place your order, he gave me a simple recipe and it turned out quite good. Shout out to you, Clark, if you're listening. And by the way, the service is a bit pricey. I have a code for you that will bring the cost down a bit. I believe it's the code URBAN, so go ahead and use that. At the same time, my call with Clark was worth the price of the order by itself. So, if nothing else, give it a shot, take advantage of that free call. And whether you're already a seasoned seafood chef or an absolute beginner like I was, that call will help you level up your skills. You can find links to everything we discuss and the resources mentioned in the show notes for this episode, which will be at mindbodypeak.com/the 165. All right, let's bring in James. James, welcome to the podcast.
I'm Happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, ever since I had one of your items earlier, I had a slice of hiramasa, which is fancy for a form of, I believe, yellowtail, amberjack, something similar fish that was sushi grade, and I did it in the form of sashimi. But I'm excited to delve into the world of seafood with you today.
The problem of even articulating the type of fish is a big part of the problem. We're so disconnected with our food, in particular our seafood. The naming conventions have not really helped. People misname fish all the time, and yellowtail, amberjack, almacojack, setiola, hitamasa, hamachi. There's so many misnomers. But yeah, when you know the farm, you know the breeding, you know what it what it was fed, and you can see a certificate of mouth. It's kind of different.
Exactly. And for most of my life, I could distinguish salmon and whitefish and sea fish, but that was about it. So this is a whole new world that I'm excited to explore with you. Before we do, what are the unusual non-negotiables you've done so far today for your health, your performance, and your bioharmony?
Well, in honor of the late Wallace J. Nichols, top of mind is just Blue Mind. I don't know if this is directly what you're looking for, but I think that there is a direct connection with just being in, on, or around the ocean that has a material effect on my health and my longevity and my wellness and my state of ease. So I pay a lot of attention to just being in the water as often as possible and really recognizing the quality of water and respecting and blessing water. I don't know how nerdy and hippie we can get on this podcast, but yeah, if you haven't read Blue Mind by Wallace J. Nichols, it's a must read.
I love that. And we can try and reduce that to negative ions or grounding or your sun exposure. But there's a instinctual urge that so many humans, myself included, feel about just getting to natural bodies of water. And there's something really special about the ocean and any sea breeze like that.
Yeah, negative ions is one thing, but there's so much more, psychologically and on a sort of spiritual path. We all came from the ocean. It's deeply ingrained in our biology and in our genetics. And when we reconnect with the ocean, there's something spiritual that is very important. And something else to be said with why I think on a biological level why seafood works really well for us, because we evolved from the oceans, and EPA and DHA exist in these marine environments, and it's part of what allowed the prefrontal cortex to develop. And yeah, so that's a non-negotiable for me, is to be in, on, or near the water all the time.
Well, that sets us up nicely. You mentioned farmed seafood earlier, and we've been talking about the ocean. And when I was coming across Seatopia, your company, I noticed that you guys proudly display on your website on the front page that you do not provide wild caught seafood as it's traditionally thought of. Can you explain to me the nuances and why wild caught isn't always healthier, and in certain circumstances where the company is sourcing and doing things properly, it's often inferior across several different domains, such as nutrition content and then also potentially heavy metals, contaminants, and toxicants?
Well, thanks for prefacing it with nuance. If anything, what the world needs is more nuance. If you were to make a generalization about farm-raised seafood and comparing it to wild-caught seafood, it could be safe to say that farm-raised seafood is inferior to wild-caught seafood on the basis of, let's just say, omega-3 content or something of that nature. There's a lot of studies that are frankly outdated that are referencing farm-raised seafood methodologies and factory farming that really proliferated in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, some even the early 2000s, that were not using the same methodologies as the farms that we are supporting. I'll preface it this way. Less than 1% of the global production of salmon that's farmed is king salmon. And of those king salmon, we work with a handful of farms that are doing things so unique that it's less than 5% of total king salmon farm production. Like king salmon raised in glacier water, freshwater environments, never exposed to environmental toxins in mountain lakes or oceans or rivers, or literally in these aquifers. There are outliers in terrestrial farming from in the cattle farming and chicken farming. We don't assume that all chicken and beef was farmed in exactly the same manner. We know that there are factory farms within beef, and we know that there are factory farms of chicken. We've known to ask for cage-free pasture-raised animals and those specific farms, and we have come to support specific farming practices and specific farms by name. And while we're doing with Seatopia is bringing that same level of visibility and education so that a handful of people who really want to support truly scalable food systems from a handful of farms actually providing solutions that can have a net positive impact on the environment can actually vote for these specific farms and get a product that's quantifiably better.
Yeah. And when you farm, you're able to control the inputs where you can't necessarily with wild seafood. And it's, I think, pretty well accepted at this point that what you eat changes your biological makeup, how your body works. But it's not just what you eat, it's what your food eats as well.
Very, very true. It's what we eat and what we ate. So in the wild, it's very difficult to say exactly what the nutritional content is of tuna, for example, because some tuna species are migrating incredible distances, like across the entire Pacific. Like you can catch tuna off the coast of California that has also been in Japan and in the Galapagos. Or the exposure of different diets as well as environmental pollutants varies significantly depending on where that animal traveled. And unfortunately, all rivers lead to the ocean, and we've been putting incredible amounts of pollution into our rivers. And all of our coal fire plants effluent putting mercury into the atmosphere is falling down into the oceans, and the levels of mercury in the ocean today are up over 300%. The concentrations of microplastics that are in the ocean today are set to outnumber the number of stars in the galaxy and the fish in the ocean. It is a very different ocean today. And I say ocean singular, it's not plural. All of the oceans are connected. There is not a pristine environment in Alaska or Antarctica that is free of microplastics. There are beaches in Alaska that are covered with plastic. There are seagulls and shrimp and seals and walruses that are testing positive for microplastics. And it's not just microplastics, all the other environmental pollutants that are attracted to those, like the BPAs, but also PCBs and DDT and all these other chemicals that are in the ocean are binding to these polymers. So unless you're raising fish in a controlled environment and controlling the feed, it's very difficult to have a predictable outcome that's not going to have a bioaccumulation. So what we're doing with Seatopia is removing these farms from the trophic accumulation by feeding them at that base layer of microalgae. So microalgae is where the EPA and DHA is produced through photosynthesis and converting sunlight into these sugars, into these oils. We can produce microalgae in fermentation tanks and grow industrial scale productions of EPA and DHA in a truly scalable way and feed those EPA and DHAs with proteins like mycelium proteins and soldier fly proteins and produce a scalable feed that is nutritionally balanced for fish. And that is, in a nutshell, the sort of filter for what we describe as innovative aquaculture projects that are not dependent on forage fish to feed fish and are not utilizing traditionally commoditized, subsidized proteins and oils like canola and soya in order to feed fish, but using algae-based oils and innovative proteins like soldier fly proteins.
What's that one? Soldier fly?
Yeah, fly larvae, basically. So there's a farm, for example, in Chile that we're working with that has a partnership with a grocery store chain, and they take all of their organic waste matter and they it gets, instead of just being dumped into traditional waste streams, it goes to a facility where they actually grow flies, soldier flies, and then the larva state, these little these larvae, these maggots, are then dried and turned into a fish meal, and then they feed that to these steelhead trout. So steelhead trout, salmon, in particular, in their juvenile state, are in the rivers foraging, eating insects and larvae, and it is part of their natural diet. Now, you combine those with a couple other amino acids and oils and fats from microalgae, and you have a very nutrient-rich diet that gives them the profile of omega-3s, EPA, and DHA that are higher than a traditional wild-caught counterpart.
I'm looking at it from two perspectives. There's the nutritional content of the fish and the seafood, what they actually contain. And then there's the heavy metal and contaminants. And do you want to maximize one, minimize the other? Continuing on with contaminants and things that you sometimes find in seafood, because you mentioned microplastics earlier. And I saw one paper where you stratify the consumers of microplastics, and not through microplastics themselves, but say plastic water bottles and things that naturally contain them. The highest consumers had a 400% increased risk of, I believe it was cardiovascular disease. And just earlier today, I was reading about how there are microplastics, and we're now discovering that there are nanoplastics that are even smaller and are just appearing to be just as dangerous as microplastics, and they can pass even easier into the bloodstream and disrupt all kinds of neuroendocrine functions.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. We don't totally understand the outcomes of living in this era where plastics have entered into our food system at this rate. 15 years ago, or maybe less, UC Davis found, they did a study where they tested wild-caught seafood all up and down the Pacific coast of California, and they went to just markets, fish markets and grocery stores, and just bought all the wild-caught fish and sampled them, and they found microplastics in 25% of fish. And then they did a similar study in Asia, and again found a similar quantity. Every year since then, we've seen those numbers increasing, the percentages. Some studies, it's up to 80% now. There was a study recently that just came out this year that found microplastics in 100% of the water samples in Alaska. So microplastics are pretty ubiquitous now. They are, as you indicated, disrupting endocrine, and there's all these studies related to coronary issues, but it's also mercury levels. And some people think that mercury is not that important, but my wife is pregnant, and we do everything we can to optimize her health and optimize the baby's health. And having a high level of selenium and omega-3s to balance and help the body detox things like mercury is great. But why not choose fish that are simply tenfold lower of mercury to begin with? And you can do that when you feed the fish a very different diet, when they're not out there eating forage fish or fish meal that bioaccumulated everything that was in the environment, when you're feeding them algae and these soldier fly larvae. And I'm not just saying this, we also are testing this. We send a sample from every single lot that is harvested to quantify the parts per billion of mercury. And this data is then extrapolated based on your age and your health profile and the type of fish you're getting. And you can work with a functional medicine doctor to say, well, you could probably eat 7 pounds of this fish a week and not have any considerations or be within the guidelines set out by the FDA or EPA. The data is empowering us to make better decisions. And all of this data is on our website. All of the certificate of analyses are transparently available. You click and download them from our website. 0 detectable levels of microplastics in these fish. So it's just drastically different. There are increasingly unknown concerns of eating wild-caught seafood or seafood that was, or farm seafood that was fed, bait fish, but also fed canola oil and soya because of other contaminants that we're putting in the soil and glyphosates and other things.
Yeah. And with a lot of these things, one exposure to some heavy metals, albeit under a certain level, or microplastics, that's probably not going to cause all the downstream health consequences, but exposure is cumulative. See, if you're getting a little from your seafood, you're getting a little from exhaust, you're getting it from soil, different things like that. Over time, that's going to snowball into something that's potentially very concerning.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm not out here by any means trying to say, don't eat this, don't eat that, don't like be like, hey, it's fine. Have this, live a little, but be conscientious of this. And if you have the data and you know what you're accumulating over time, you're able to make better decisions. To be clear, we don't sell tuna. We've never sold tuna. There are some people who purport to do farm raised tuna. I don't think it's truly a scalable food system because their metabolism is so different. They expend so much energy. They're warm-blooded creatures. They're moving fast all the time. It's the ratio is about 20 pounds of feed to 1 pound of growth. So it's just not an efficient use of the feed conversion ratio. Whereas some of the fish we work with, it's like 1-to-1 ratio. The ideal of a single line and a single hook from an artisan fisher, a mom and pop, that's beautiful. But the reality today is that most industrial scale fishers are using technology developed for underwater warfare to identify where the schools are. They have science that collaborates to like when the spawning seasons are and the breeding aggregations, and they go and they can decimate entire populations very, very quickly. We are in the midst of the 6th great extinction on this planet. There is a new species going extinct every 20 minutes. We're doing something that's very difficult, is trying to create some awareness for the handful of solutions that exist that are using farm seafood, but are actually doing it right, that are part of the solution, that are raising these fish from eggs on a clean diet, farming them in low density environments, and in some cases having a net positive impact on the environment by introducing multi-trophic aquaculture practices or polytrophic practices that create symbiotic relationships between that fish poop and filter feeders and kelp and things of that nature.
That's almost like biodynamic agriculture, but better instead.
100%. It is the same thing. It is modeling the farming inputs to catalyze the natural ecosystem services and create this sort of abundant flywheel of nature, of ecology. So yeah, fish poop is not bad for the environment unless the seed was bad and the concentration of it is in a poorly sited environment where there is not a significant tidal fluctuation or current, and or B, a symbiotic partnership. But in natural systems, fish poop, just like on land, is fertilizer. It boosts the availability for other organisms to survive. And there's significant swaths of the ocean, of this planet. Offshore environments generally are so low in nutrients that you cannot farm scallops, or mussels or oysters or seaweeds. It's a low nutrient environment. If you introduced fish to that environment, fish poop to that environment, all of a sudden you start to create the base nutrient level for some of those organisms, and you can actually create these sort of fish aggregating or fish attracting devices by having a fish farm in the open ocean. And this has been quantified, with farms like the Kamplachi farm that we work with in Hawaii that has these open ocean nets, at over 200 feet of water. These net pens are floating out there with tons of current, and in an environment that nobody used to go fishing there. Nobody used to frequent there. You look at the environmental impact studies that they did in the environment before, there was not much there. And on the sea floor, it was not much there. Today, it's started to create a fish attracting device, and fishermen are regularly going there to go fishing because in and around that environment, there's now structure and habitat and nutrients to support a new ecosystem.
That's amazing. You've probably heard this before, James, but when must have been 5 or more years ago, I came across headlines saying that wild caught seafood, and specifically, I think it was salmon, is higher in mercury than the farm raised equivalent. Is there truth to that?
Yeah. Um, Depending on the feed that the farm raised salmon are eating, it will either have an increased bioaccumulation of mercury or a decreased level. So the salmon farming industry really only matured in the 1980s. The very first, very tiny attempts at farming salmon happened in the 1970s. And what they did at the beginning is they just took the bait fish, the sardines and anchovies, and fed those to salmon. And as a result, the salmon in the wild and the salmon in the farms had very similar nutrient content. But then when they started grinding them up and they saw that there was increased levels of whatever was in the bait fish. So they were starting to bioaccumulate higher concentrations of both positive and negative things, whether it was omega-3s or mercury and other pollutants that were in the environment. The industry in general, led by the UN initiative to increase sustainability and of farming, fish farming in general, and reduce impact on forage fish, on bait fish to feed them, said, hey, you guys need to find a better system than just feeding them wild sardines and anchovies and anchovetas. So what a lot of people in the industry did was started using the most low cost form of proteins and fats, which is our industrial grown commodity canola oil and soy protein. And canola oil and soy protein do not have high levels of mercury in them. So when they started using those feeds, the concentration, the bioaccumulation of mercury went down significantly. So fish that are fed soy and corn are going to have much lower levels of mercury, but they're also going to have an imbalance of those omega-3s and omega-6s. Let's just call it aquaculture 1.0 was like feed them bait fish. And then 2.0 was let's feed them subsidized corn and soy. And now we're in kind of 3.0, which is let's feed them the proper nutrients that they need so that you don't have to give them antibiotics and hormones. Because by the way, those fish that they were feeding the canola and the soy, they also ended up having inflammation in their gut and they're more susceptible to disease because their immune systems are compromised, inflammation. And so they started feeding them preventative antibiotics. Now we're like, okay, well, we've got to optimize for nutrition to really boost the immune systems of these animals to begin with so that we don't have to give them antibiotics. And how do you do that? Well, looks like increasing EPA and DHA has a significant impact on reducing inflammation. And if done right, paired with the right proteins, you can actually remove those corns and soys. And so what we're seeing right now, what Seatopia is doing is working with farms that have been doing commodity aquaculture and saying, hey, there is a market that wants to pay for more production and is willing to pay the cost for the more expensive algae and soldier fly proteins because we want more nutritious fish that has the right balance of omega-3s to omega-6s. And so that's kind of 3.0 where we're at today is trying to create enough aggregated demand for more farms to make these transitions. Because a lot of farms, they're not getting any pushback from their buyers. There's plenty of buyers out there who are saying, hey, just keep bringing the price down and we'll keep buying more. And, the Costco's of the world and the big grocery store chains, they're not disclosing the details of what's in the salmon, what it was fed and what the nutrient contents are. They're just saying, hey, can you lower the price?
So the issue with the farmed is, yes, it might be lower in mercury, but you're going to be higher in omega-6. And I assume that these labels don't have to disclose that they also add antibiotics. Maybe they do, but it's not a clear cut winner between wild cut or factory farmed for most things you find in the grocery store. And you probably are going to have lower levels of selenium in the factory farmed, like your average factory farm. Again, these are all like averages. So you'll probably have higher levels of protective selenium in the wild caught than you would in your average factory farmed.
Look, we're making big generalizations here, and that's part of the problem. It's a slippery slope to start making generalizations, but that's also part of the problem in that the seafood industry is not held to the same accountability on nutrition labels that you see in other industries, um, because it's almost impossible to do with wild caught seafood. You take a sample of one wild caught fish, and these are the nutrient facts associated. That's going to be very different to another fish caught in the exact same net. It varies so significantly, and that's why we're in this unique space where you don't see other companies doing, you know, certificate analysis on every lot for mercury or whatever, because they just can't scalably do that with every fish. Whereas in a controlled environment with fish being raised on the exact same feed in the exact same environment, we have figured out to a science how to predict that. So there's always unknowns with the weather and whatnot, but the practices of farming is what allowed civilization to evolve to the point where we are today, probably needing a correction in the pendulum swing of population growth. But the reality is farming creates more predictable outcomes, and wild caught extraction is not what fueled, the growth and stability in society. There used to be market-based hunters, but that was replaced by farmers because we killed all of our bison, and that job as a market-based hunter went away, and it was a lot more predictable and scalable to farm. We're learning how to do that in the ocean. Aquaculture got a bad name. Farm fish got a bad name because the very first farms to scale got money from big ag, and big ag used the exact same business model to produce giant monocultures using these sort of protections with antibiotics and whatnot. But it's not the only way. There are farms doing things in a beautiful way, and it's our job to celebrate those farmers and educate people about specific farming practices. Integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, IMTA, algae-based feeds, recirculating aquaculture systems. These are sort of niche terms in the aquaculture space today, but I believe 10, 15 years from now, that'll be as commonplace as asking for cage-free, grass-fed, grass-finished, pasture-raised, regenerative beef and chicken.
James, this also makes me think that the headlines that come out about this fish having this level of nutrients or this level of toxins, it's very easy to manipulate that data and just check, say, these particular 3 farms or these particular locations. And you can kind of like Ansel Keys and his 7-country study to villainize fat. You can just really twist the data to make it support whatever agenda it is that you want to further.
Yeah, especially in a day and age when in the United States, we still have a relatively healthy, albeit shrinking, wild-caught fishery that has a huge budget, and they are threatened for real reasons. I mean, you have communities that are dependent on wild capture fisheries. These are real people, thousands and thousands of people whose livelihood depends on it. And in some instances, they're well organized because for generations, they've been deeply ingrained in politics and policy, and farmed seafood is perceived as a threat. So it's very easy for people to just fund scientific data research studies, documentaries that skew the data. I'll give you a really concrete example. I used to work at a farm in Mexico that was producing some of the best yellowtail in the world, algae-based feed, low density, deep water farming, just beautiful, swimming in these turquoise waters with thousands of these friendly fish that would come rub up against you, and just feeling so part of the solution and really proud of what we were doing. And another farm came to that same part of Mexico and started raising the same species, and yet they were using copper-based nets and inferior feed and inferior handling. And Monterey Seafood Watch, which is by all means one of the most respected certifying bodies or auditing bodies, they gave a rating on farm-raised yellowtail from Mexico that lumped both of our farms in the exact same bucket, even though our farm is using totally different feed, totally different farming practices, resulting in a very different nutritional fish and different environmental impacts. And to dump them both in the same generalized bucket had potential to ruin the entire business. How do you get a consumer to pay for a better quality fish if the rating systems and general public thinks that they're all the same? We have to get beyond these generalizations that all fish raised in a certain country, all farms in a certain country are exactly the same. There are outliers. There are these really cool cooperatives, oftentimes, female-led cooperatives that are doing extensive farming. Extensive farming is such a cool thing. The opposite of intensive farming. Extensive farming, you generally don't even feed these organisms. So we work with this collective of shrimp farmers in South Vietnam, and they literally are being paid to reforest mangroves. And then they work with a hatchery that releases a native species of shrimp, black tiger shrimp, into these mangrove ponds, and they don't feed them at all. They literally are just in the mangroves foraging for zooplankton and phytoplankton and eating the natural diet. And at certain full moons and new moons, the tide gets such that they can create these other little canals and corral them and harvest them, and then they sell them to us at a premium product that helps reforest these mangroves. There are no inputs into these shrimp. This is literally like helping reforest mangroves and raise these shrimp in a totally pristine way. So to think that shrimp from Asia is bad is not thinking deeply enough. It's what specific farm, because granted, there are farms doing just the opposite, doing intensive farm shrimp that are going in and bulldozing mangroves and building these ponds and feeding them white leg shrimp, which is a totally different species, and feeding them antibiotics. And it's the opposite. It's degrading the environment. It's producing an unhealthy product. We have to know where the farm is, but also what did they eat and how were they raised and who did it and when did they harvest them.
100 years ago, you didn't have organics like you do today. You didn't have grass-fed, grass-finished. And the general consensus around seafood is that regardless of where you get it, whether it's like processed seafood or it's fresh, it's all healthy. It seems to me that like seafood in general is just a couple decades behind the land-based meat culture where, like you were saying, in the near future, we're going to have all these other keywords to look for on the labels. But for now, it seems like the tides are turning, pun intended. And the best way to go about this is to choose the right sources of seafood. And just because the tide hasn't turned all the way yet, seafood is still viewed as healthy. You might not be getting what your chronometer or nutrient calculator online says you're going to get, say, the zinc level or selenium from seafood.
Yeah, that's such an interesting analogy. We do have these understandings of like the Mediterranean diet, that seafood is so healthy and that these blue zones where people ate a lot of seafood live, to be centenarians. The nutritional quality of that seafood is different though today, than it was when those centenarians were in their 20s, and 30s and 40s. I believe that there are great examples of the ocean's ability to bioremediate and to clean and recreate abundant ecosystems. But we have so much microplastics and DDT and these other forever chemicals that are persistent for a long time. Nature will adapt and figure out ways to solve this, from radiation to all these. Nature finds a way to break this stuff down, but it takes a long time. In the interim, it's showing up in our blood, in placenta, in testicles. Microplastics are showing up in the interim. Our household, we're just very mindful of mitigating exposures and empowering as much as we can our food to be medicine. And it's interesting to talk about the bioavailability of omega 3s in fish compared uh, to supplements. I'm sure you know a lot more about this than I do, but I feel vital when I eat sushi grade seafood. I feel like the nutrients are just immediately available to me. And I don't feel that way eating canned tuna, and I don't feel that way just taking omega 3 supplements. Yeah, I think there's something to do with the form of those, the oxidation of those omega 3s that translates to whether or not your body is able to assimilate that and use that in an efficient way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the traditional fish oil supplement comes in ethyl ester form and well utilized by the body by any means. There are better versions like the triglyceride form, and certain fish naturally have it in the phospholipid form. I believe krill oil does as well. I also look at that, and the omegas, especially omega 3, get a ton of attention. And I also at the same time wonder if it's the actual omega 3 that's making you feel vital, or it's one of the other related fatty acids, the other odd chain lipids. There's one called C15, and a company called Fatty 15 now produces this, and it's present in some certain seafood naturally, and they're showing that it has a lot of the benefits. Like some of the research around omega 3s is conflicting. Some show that it's great, some show that it has adverse effects. It perhaps is a metabolite, or it's an other odd chain lipid that's yielding a lot of the benefits, but it could also be something like one of the other nutrients that are much higher in seafood that you can't easily get from most other foods. I personally think that's one of the main reasons to include seafood in the diet, is that it helps round out nutrition profiles. And I'm sure you know better than I do what nutrients are present in larger quantities in seafood than, say, meat or other animal-based land foods.
I mean, you've hit on a couple of them like seleniums, but vitamin A and vitamin D. There's a handful of nutrients and macronutrients. I'm not an expert on nutritionist in this regard, but I know firsthand, anecdotally, that seafood for me, for my blood type, works really, really well. My wife, on the other hand, she is a red meat eater. She always would choose that over fish. But my daughter and I, like, seafood works for us. It works for our body type. Um, Something to do with our genetics.
One of the components of raising seafood that we haven't discussed, but we were talking about offline, is the way that the animal ends its life. And I've explored this a bit when it comes to factory farmed meat, and the higher stress levels, those lead to adaptive selection, where certain microorganisms and pathogens become more prevalent, and the microRNA within that meat contains information, biological information, that when we consume it within 15 minutes, it's detectable in our bloodstream, and it acts as epigenetic switches, turning on and off the expression of certain genes. And I learned today, I had no idea, it makes sense, that seafood is similar in that the way it lives out its final minutes, hours, maybe day, impacts the overall like longevity of the product, and probably the health benefits and health effects of its consumption.
I didn't know about this RNA, but it just makes so much sense. Then the epigenetic switches that the smell of fish being fishy is unfortunately a byproduct of years and years of disrespectfully killing fish and disrespectfully handling fish. And when I say disrespectfully, I mean you're not respecting the life that was in that if you are allowing it to get fishy. Fish do not smell fishy in the ocean. That association of fishy fish happens because it's starting to oxidize, because it's starting to go bad, because you created either a petri dish environment or a combination of the increased amount of lactic acid that built up in that fish in the way that it died or fought or was asphyxiated. They do have arteries like you and I in veins, but they also have this bloodline, these areas where blood transfers through the muscle in a different way than we do. And you can see it's called a bloodline. And the thickness of the bloodline on two different fish caught two different ways will be built up very significantly different. And with species like tuna that are warm blooded, they will actually burn their fish. It'll turn totally black depending on how much it fought when it died. In Japan, for example, they actually noticed this, like how you could grade the tuna just by drilling a hole into it, getting a course sample out of the tail, and also like up near the midsection, and seeing how thick the bloodline was and the color of that bloodline, how much lactic acid built up. It was a direct correlation to A, how that fish fought and died and how stressful it was, and B, how much fat is going to be left. Does it burn through those fat reserves? And how long is it going to last? How quickly is it going to get fishy? And how quickly are those uh, fragile long chain omega-3 fatty acids going to oxidize? So they started experiment with different ways of killing the fish as quickly as possible. A, you want to catch it as quickly as possible. So a tuna that was caught on a line and fought for 6 hours is so burnt. You could literally take something from being worth premium sushi grade, uh, toro to being cat food if you don't catch it quickly. But then B, they also had to optimize for how do you cool the fish down, relax the fish, get that lactic acid out of that fish. And one of the technologies developed is called, or techniques, it's called EKG, and it's a practice of removing the blood from the fish as quickly as possible to get that lactic acid out. And so what they do, sorry for the vegans in this audience, but it's pretty graphic, is they will first spike the brain, and they'll put a spike into the brain, and then they'll push a metal wire down the spinal cord, and that A, kills the brain and then kills the nervous system, so the fish stops moving and stops feeling, and then but the heart is still beating, and while the heart's still beating, then they will put a couple of incisions behind the gills where all blood goes through and out in the tail, and the heart will keep it'll pump its own blood right out, and then they throw it into an ice bath. But they're doing it with the intention of trying to get the lactic acid out as possible. And when they do it right, it is optimizing for longer shelf life, reduced lactic acid. But when they're really coordinated, they'll take a fish from swimming in a relaxed environment to brain dead, bled out on ice within a minute. And that's a relatively humane way compared to that fish fighting on a hook and line for an hour or 2 hours or longer and then bleeding out. I'll give you another example of a farm that we work with where they're actually raising fish in these nets where they've lived there for a year and a half, 2 years, sometimes longer, being fed a diet. They're totally comfortable with the environment. They're relaxed. There's divers cleaning the nets. They're getting fed a healthy diet. When they harvest them, they'll use a big pump, a tube, and they'll pump the fish into the well tank of a larger boat. And that tank is full of highly oxygenated water. And that highly oxygenated water has so much oxygen that after they went through that tank, through that pump, and they're a little bit confused and a little bit stressed out, they go into this super hot, oxygen-rich environment, and they actually relax very quickly. They're exposed to this environment so that their heart rate comes down and they relax. And when they're totally relaxed, they get kind of ushered into a corral when one fish at a time goes through this narrow canal, and there's an automated system that spikes them, bleeds them, and does the EKG.
I love that. It's obviously a bit more expensive than going through the traditional route. I wish more companies and farms around the world would do this. And it'd be really cool to see a large scale comparison between fish caught the traditional way versus these methods to see how the meat compares, everything that's in it and potentially isn't in it as well. James, I want to talk more about Seatopia in a second. Before we do, a couple other things for you. If you were, say, out of the country and you couldn't get a Seatopia package delivered to you and you were tasked with organizing a seafood dinner, how would you go about that to get decent quality or greater seafood?
I would start with finding what farms are in that country that I'm at and asking them what is in their feed. What do they feed them? And that information alone is a good start, because if it's corn and soy, they're probably going to be using antibiotics as well. If they're using microalgae and other innovative proteins, I would say, hey, that's a farm I definitely want to try. And then I would ask if I can come and visit. And you'd be surprised. A lot of these farms that are doing things right are stoked to have people come visit. If you're doing things wrong, it's a little different story.
Well, sadly, just about every form of seafood I've gotten from a bunch of different local grocers smells and tastes quite fishy, which is one of the main deterrents for me for most of my life was just the smell and like the fishy taste. I was also concerned about the whole defrosting process. The number one place where people go wrong is they just toss it in hot water and it thaws too fast and you don't ruin it per se, but you lose a lot of the magic.
That's what it takes to make a great meal off that. It's just a little bit of planning ahead, a little bit of, like the chefs call it, mise en place, prepping these things ahead of time, making, slicing the tomatoes and the cilantro and these little things ahead of time and having everything all prepped and ready. And then, you go and fire up the stove or the oven and you have everything ready. That intention, with seafood often means I transfer that fish from the freezer to the fridge, wrap it in the special tuna paper ahead of time and let it defrost nice and slow. And I check on it the next morning and change those paper towels and make sure that it's dry to avoid creating that sort of petri dish environment. You don't want your fish sitting wet. You don't ever want your proteins wet. It should always be dry. You don't want to create a petri dish environment for your proteins. Dry aged meat gets better over time because it's cold and dry, not cold and wet. And the same thing is true with your fish when you're defrosting it. You want it to be dry, dry, dry. You want it to be wicking moisture. If you're going to do an accelerated defrost, don't do it under hot water. Do it under ice water, please. That's the if you are in a hurry, but it is better if you do it slow. It's also worth noting that a lot of sushi chefs will say that they only use fresh fish, and the reality is a lot of them are required to use frozen fish. If you're in the United States, the FDA has a regulation on the parasite destruction protocol for sushi bars is that if it is wild caught seafood, it's supposed to be frozen before consumed to kill parasites. Freezing fish doesn't result in a mushy fish if you're using the last freezer or super freezer. Mushy fish results because you're of low temperature or not low enough temperature freezers that freeze slowly and or fluctuating temperatures. So like the freezer above your fridge, your home freezer, has an auto de-icing, and that fluctuation in temperature, when it de-ices, the ice that's in your freezer is melting. Well, also the ice crystals that are inside the fish are expanding and contracting. Every time they expand and contract, they're cutting through and cutting those muscle fibers and the delicate tissues of the fish, and it's gonna be brittle. And then when you finally defrost, it's gonna be mushy. So we tell our customers, don't refreeze our fish. This was blast frozen at peak freshness using a super freezer or a nitrogen freezer. Put it in your freezer. If you're going to use it sushi grade, use it within the 30 days. Transfer it to your fridge the day you're going to use it or the day before you're going to use it. If you're not planning on using it, like you're going out of town or whatever, put it in a deep freezer, like the freezers that you have in your garage, the top loading ones, the ones that do not have auto de-icing, they build up ice around the outside. That's actually a good thing because that stable temperature is going to preserve delicate sushi grade seafood longer. You just have to handle the water content in fish, and the muscle fibers in fish are very different than the muscle fibers and the water content in meat or chicken, for example.
I have one more question on topic for you, and then we'll wrap this one up. When you go out for seafood, say sushi particularly, are you using anything to help combat against the potential of parasites, such as increasing stomach acid with a supplement or apple cider vinegar or anything like that?
Full transparency, after over 10 years of working in the industry, I have a lot of friends that are chefs, and I've been able to work with very well-regarded Michelin star chefs. And I generally only go to restaurants now where I actually know where they're sourcing from. And a lot of them I used to supply to. And, then the chefs just go from one restaurant to another. And so I've stayed within my knowledge base. That said, if I do go to a sushi bar that doesn't have, 100% products that I know the source, I'm always, there's a risk, and I don't have that full arsenal of tools that you just described, but I always double down on sort of the detoxification things like the chlorella and a handful of other sort of detoxifying sort of supplements, but that's the extent of my sort of biohacker toolkit. Yeah, I also like to, by the way, incorporate things like spirulina into recipes. It's been really interesting to like emulsify spirulina into olive oil and make like a dressing with that. It's actually quite beautiful and functional.
Yeah. Some companies use spirulina for the deep green color and then chlorella. Wait, no, thinking backwards. Spirulina for the blue and chlorella for the green colors, and they use that as like a natural way of coloring food.
Yeah, yeah. You can do
Cool.
that in a culinary fashion as well, and it's very beautiful and serves some function.
Yeah, lots of function there too. Well, James, thank you. This has been a blast. I've learned a lot about the whole process, and I'm rethinking some of the claims I read about seafood, given that the quality varies tremendously. If people want to connect with you to give Seatopia a shot, how do they go about that?
Seatopia.fish is our website. Please check out Seatopia.fish on the Instagrams and stuff like that. It's at Seatopia. I personally on LinkedIn, and yeah, would love to hear from more people. I'm glad to hear that it got you thinking. I mean, that's the whole thing, is how do we get people just to ask better questions?
Yeah, and we set up a special code for my audience if they want to use, I think it's Urban, that will give them a special on their, is it first order?
Awesome. I don't know. You probably set that up with one of my associates. That's great.
Well, James, what is one thing the Seatopia tribe does not know about you?
One thing that Seatopia tribe does not know about me. Um, they probably don't know that I'm going to be a dad for the second time here in the next week or so. That's exciting.
Wow.
Um,
Congrats.
they probably don't know that despite the recommendations of all the crew on my boat, I've jumped in the ocean with sharks and had the opportunity of swimming with killer whales. That was cool. I got to play a concert to a pod of killer whales. A concert of one me alone being dragged behind paddleboard with a steel drum, and I found that I could actually communicate to them, and they were responding to the steel drum. People might not know that.
Lots of great examples, and your passion for sea life in general shines through. But James, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. We've been going for a while. Really appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with next.
Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate you asking these questions and helping bring this education to a broader audience.
I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I love knowing who's in the 1% committed to reaching their full potential. Comment 1% below so that I know who you are. For all the resources and links, meet me on my website at mindbodypeak.com. I appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you. As a reminder, the information depicted in this video is for information purposes only. Please consult your primary healthcare professional before making any lifestyle changes.